Here, I'm going to show you how to make a powerful visual analysis of your data in Excel. And in this tutorial, we're going to take basic plain text and transform it into what you see in front of you here. And for this example, I'm going to be analyzing sales for stores across multiple years and months, but you could use this for pretty much any data set because the skills I show you here are going to be universally applicable to analyzing your data in a visual way. Now let me show you what we can do here. Let's say I want to look at the stores Atlantis and Springfield. So I'm going to deselect Green Mall and Greenville, and I want to look at them between 2019 and 2020 to see what's going on here. So I can see that the Springfield store is doing okay, the Atlantis store is not doing so hot. Now let me compare the Januaries between these years. I think something funny is going on there, and I can see that's definitely going to be a problem. So let's analyze January a little bit more, and let's say that we run a promotion every Monday, and I want to see if the promotion was the problem or not. So I go to the weekday up here and I click Monday, and now what we are doing is looking at the Mondays in January for 2020 and 2019 for the Atlantis and Springfield store. And I can see that the Mondays don't seem to be a problem. So let's move on to the sales for Tuesday and see if there's anything going on there. And yes, I can definitely see a drop there. So maybe I want to analyze that a little bit more. So let's zoom into the data set. I can click the plus sign down here, and I will go from years to months. So if we had multiple months here, you would see those displayed. And now let's go to days. So here we can see the Mondays for each one. And what I want to show you by this is that this analysis is really great at different levels. So let's say that here it's not so great, so we click the minus sign and back up, and I can see the overall trend that it's down. And what you're going to do with this information is then to dig deeper. And maybe you want to look at the products that were actually sold between 2019 and 2020. And let's see, maybe you couldn't sell them for as much. Maybe you weren't able to sell the same products. Maybe a manufacturer is no longer in existence. And that type of analysis you would be able to do in other types of charts all the way down here, where you could compare the different products and the profit margins and the gross sales between the manufacturer and the categories and all of that. So what I'm going to show you here is the foundation that you can use to build out your analysis. And I expect you to take this right here and make something so much more complex so you can figure out exactly what's going on.
Before we start, check the video description and click the link to Teach Excel so you can download the files for the tutorial and follow along. And make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials.
All right, this is where we left off in the intro, and now let's lift the veil and see what's going on behind it, because you may have noticed that we don't see very much here in terms of grid lines or headers or the formula bar, and there's only one tab. Are there any other tabs? Well, let's find out shortly. So go to the view up here, and let's bring back the ribbon menu. Let's turn on the formula bar, and let us go ahead and bring back headings and grid lines so you can see that we are just in a regular spreadsheet right here. And let's right click a dashboard and go to unhide. It's currently off the screen. And what we are going to see is a helper sheet and raw. And let's unhide both of these. So helper, there we can see a little pivot table. And let's unhide raw. And here we're going to see the raw data. So what we are going to do is to take raw data, turn it into a table, then put it into a pivot table, then create a pivot chart from it, then create slicers from it, then put all of the visual elements over here on the dashboard and hide everything else. Now, it sounds like a lot, and it kind of is, but I'm going to walk you through all the steps. So let me delete everything and let's get started. All right, so this is what we're going to start with, a basic workbook with a single sheet and a bunch of imported data. So I'm going to assume that you have already imported the data and you have it exactly how you want. Now, one important thing that you're going to want to do when you import data, especially something like raw sales data, is to add helper columns. Helper columns are life, helper columns are happiness. And what I have over here are some helper columns. We have some for the dates that I'll talk about in a moment, and then one to get a store name from a store ID. Now the trick for that is basically to perform lookups. And in my full VBA course, we do all of this in an automated way. So you click a button, have the data imported, have all your helper columns added, and all of this data input automatically. You can do it by hand. It's not really that difficult. It just adds a few extra steps and takes a little bit longer. But one trick is to turn all of this into a table. That's going to make your life so much easier. So click anywhere in here and then go to Insert, Table, and please, please, please have headers. Headers make your life so much easier. So then check My Table has headers, make sure it has headers, hit OK. And now we have a table. And I played around with the formatting a little bit, so let me change this back to white. So it's a little bit easier to read. There we go. And if you are adding helper columns by hand now and formulas by hand, the table is great because it's going to automatically add a new column if you start inputting data here. And if you input a formula at the top, it is usually going to fill in the formula all the way down for you. So it goes a long way for helper columns. But now that you have your table, let's go ahead and give it a new name. We don't have to do it in this example, but I like to do it because when you start to work with VBA, it's very helpful to know what your table does by the name. And this is called table raw. It's where our raw data goes. And let's rename this tab to raw. And now we have a new sheet. And let's call this one helper because we want it to help us present our data, but we don't want to show it later on. So helper helps us identify that it's also going to be hidden. Now go back here, click in your table, and then go to Insert and Pivot Table. Select Existing Worksheet, and then go to the Helper tab, click A1, hit OK. And now we have a pivot table over here. And you could rename this pivot table as well if you wanted to. We could call this one, how about PT Store Sales. Once again, that makes it much easier to reference if you are using VBA. And I do that a lot in my VBA course, which I'm making, so I'm going to rename everything now. So this has been renamed. And now let's go ahead and build the pivot table. And I have to tell you that pivot tables are a real pain if you don't understand them. And I'm not going to cover them in depth here. I'm just going to show you how to make this one. But I highly recommend that you take time to play around with pivot tables because it only seems like magic until you learn how to use them. But it's not that difficult to learn. So what do we want to do here? Well, I want to look at my store sales across time. And we have added a number of helper columns for time that are going to help us greatly. So let us go down here, and instead of adding our actual date column, date time, that is formatted as a date, Excel sees it as a date, we are going to add our helper columns here. So we're going to add year to rows, and then underneath that I want to access month, and then underneath that I want to access weekday, and then underneath that I want to access day of month. And this is what allows us to hit the plus button on the chart to go deeper into the data, which may help us see additional trends. And you can see that it is building out that sort of structure down here. And here we have the pluses and minuses where you can expand and collapse fields as well. And clicking the plus and the minus on the chart does that. So now we have all of our dates. And let's go ahead and put the data on it that we want to present. I want to present the sales, so I'm going to click Total, that's our sales, and put it in the Values area. And this now says Count of Total, which is not what we want. So click this. It's a little bit off the screen right now, but go to a Value Field Settings. And here in the Summarize Values By tab, go to Sum, hit OK. But before that, let's go ahead and change the number format as well because I want accounting. And hit OK. And OK. And now we have a sum of total. And side note, by the way, if you want to reference this field in VBA now, you should go ahead and rename sum of total to something that is much more useful and easier to remember how to reference. These default names are very annoying, at least in my opinion. But we're not talking about VBA. So we now have our values and our dates, but we need our stores. And what we want to do is to compare the stores against each other, which means that we have to add the stores into the columns area. So we go down here to store name so that we can understand what store we're referencing just by looking at it, as opposed to the store ID. And now we have a column for each one of our stores and a grand total column as well. And this is actually the final pivot table that we want. Now I have to say that if you're not familiar with pivot tables, this step might take you quite a long time. And what I recommend doing is actually waiting until you do the next step, which I'm going to show you, which is adding a chart, and then play around with this. So get a base pivot table going, then add your chart, and then play around with these fields to see how it changes your chart so that you can see if it makes the data presentable in a way that's going to help you or confuse you, which is actually very easy to do with pivot tables and charts. And we're ready to go to the pivot chart, but before that, I said I was going to talk about dates. Dates are kind of a big thing because in later versions of Excel, they're going to automatically group them for you. So if I grabbed this date time field, which is an actual date in Excel, it's right here. It is seen as a date. It is a date serial number. So if I change it to general, you can see the lovely serial format for the Excel date right there. Now let me back that up. If I put this field into the pivot table over here, it would automatically group out years, months, quarters, and sometimes other ranges. And you can do that, and it can be very helpful because then it will automatically add this sort of grouping setup to your data. And there are a couple problems with that. It's very difficult to change the appearance of that. Whereas here, all we have to do to change how these are represented is to go to our raw table and change the values in our helper column, and it will automatically change how it looks in the pivot table. But much more important than that is if you have many pivot tables based off of the same data and the same pivot cache, it's a little bit technical, but just think of it as based off the same data. If you have a lot of pivot tables based off that, and you group your dates, and then you're building more pivot tables and more pivot tables, and you forget how the dates were grouped, and maybe you take one grouping off, then it will mess up another pivot table that used that grouping, because date grouping is specific to a pivot cache, not a pivot table. Now, that may sound very confusing. If it sounds confusing, don't worry. The main point, all I'm trying to say is that it is much easier if you're going to use multiple pivot tables to have helper columns over here. So, if you have the default groupings that are placed in there when you place a date time field in there, just pull them out and place your helper columns in there. Now that's enough about dates and pivot tables, two of the sometimes most complex topics in Excel. The point is now we have our pivot table and now we want to represent it in a chart. So we click in our pivot table, go to Pivot Table Analyze, and then go to Pivot Chart. And here what we want is a line chart. Hit OK. And here we have our lovely chart with all of the data points on it. And you can see immediately that too many data points is very difficult to read. So let's hit the minus button here and watch the pivot table behind it as well. When I do this, it will collapse the fields and then make it much easier to analyze. And let's do it one more time. Perfect. And that's why it's so helpful to have this chart linked up with the pivot table. Now, if you hate all of these little gray buttons on here, which oftentimes I do because it's not always helpful, then just click your chart, go to Pivot Chart Analyze, and click Field Buttons or the drop-down menu and hide all. And they will be gone and it will look a lot more like a normal chart. In this example, I do want those there though, so I'm going to hit Control Z to back that up. And I do want to have a little title, so I'm going to click the plus. Now, if your version of Excel does not have the little plus guy, you can just click the chart and go to Design, and you can control pretty much everything from Add Chart Element. So we could do Chart Title right here, and then Above Chart. And let's make that guy Store Sales, and just select all of that. I'm going to bold it and make it 20. And remember, this is the step where you want to play around with your pivot table and see how it's going to look on your chart. And once you've made sure that the pivot table and the pivot chart work well together and show the data how you want to see it, then it's time to go on to the slicers. And the slicers are our filters. And that's why we don't have to add anything to the filter field or the filter area down here. So we just click in our pivot table anywhere, go to Pivot Table Analyze, and then go to Insert Slicer, and choose all of the slicers that you want. We want to deal with our helper date column. So I want year, I want month, I want weekday, and maybe you want day of month so that you can look at a specific day and a specific year and a specific month. And let's go for store name as well. Hit OK. And we're going to get all of those now. And what I like to do when I'm starting out building these guys is just drag them over here, have it look messy, it doesn't really matter, and then just play around with them and make sure that everything kind of works how I want it to work. And just see how the data works. Remember, for your slicers, if you click the little check mark thing right here, you can select multiple items at once, and that can be helpful. And if you click little filter icon right here, it will clear all of the selections for that slicer. So once you've made sure that everything works well, then we can take it from here and put it on a dashboard worksheet and make everything look nice and neat. And then our boss will be happy. So let's click that, and then of course this can get in the way, so let's close it now. And then hold Control, or actually you don't need to do that. We could hold Control and click all these guys like this. Or what we could do is go to Page Layout and then go to Selection Pane, then just click one and hit Control A, then Control X, then Dashboard, and Control V. And there we go. And now close this guy, and let's clear all the filters. Okay. And now begins the process of making your dashboard look nice, which can take an annoying amount of time, but I'm going to show you a little helpful thing to make it go faster. So if you click the slicers and go to Slicer, and then Align, and then Snap to Shape, and make sure Snap to Grid is also checked, then that's going to make it easier to set things up. So what we can do then is grab our shapes, and you can do that Align trick, Snap to Grid, Snap to Shape from any shape, by the way. And then sort of grab our slicers and begin the process of lining everything up and fitting the data on there. Now another tip for slicers is to add multiple columns to them. So click your slicer, go to Slicer, and then over here on the right, Columns, let us add another column. So that starts to fit on there a little bit nice. And line that up. Then we can line up year. Let's make it like that. Pull that guy up. And month. And just keep doing this until everything is nice and neat and lined up. And now just fast forward through that part because it's going to take forever. Now I want to show you another trick when you line everything up. The columns right here, we can change the size and everything around it will move because we have not changed the size and properties of these shapes. So let's click one here and hold Control and go between all of these guys and then resize one, and we are going to get a nice even spacing between them and everything snaps back onto the screen. And then don't forget to go to the View tab and take off the formula bar headings and grid lines. And let's get this guy minimized. And now we are having a pretty darn nice looking dashboard. So let's go ahead and hide. It's off the screen right now, but just go to Hide. And then right click and hide. And now we have only our dashboard tab, and we can sift through everything exactly how we want to do it. Let's go to January again, Tuesday, zoom in again, perfect. And let's actually not forget one thing. So if you leave it at the regular chart type like this, and you can do this almost endlessly, this formatting step, by the way, but this one's a little important. So if I go to only one day, let's say, or one data point, let's just zoom out to the year level, and then go for just 2019, you won't see anything on the screen. just change, so go to the little brush icon right here, or go to the Design tab to, I believe, the very first option right here. Yeah. And then you get these little points. And these little points, when we have multiple options selected, are, there you go. They show at the ends of the line, so the data points. And I think that's enough formatting tips for this because it really could go on forever. But this allows you to take your raw text and then make it into something that's presentable that you can use to drill down and look for any trends and see what's going on. And like I said at the beginning of this tutorial, this is not where your analysis should end. Like in my VBA course in the second project, this is just one of many charts that we have so that we can sift through the sales and see exactly what's going on. And you could do all of that down here, but the point is that you would follow the same pattern of going from the raw data, adding the helper columns, add the pivot table, and then slice and dice the pivot table however you want to, and then present it on a chart so it's a little bit easier to analyze the data. So the foundation will stay the same, but the data is going to change. And I hope that you can use this to make more powerful analysis of your workbooks.
I hope you liked the tutorial. If it was helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials.